Hi and welcome to In Focus. I'm Rtdnac. 20 years ago this week, the world as we knew it changed forever. Saturday marks 2 full decades since the attacks of September 11th, 2001. It was on that day that up until that point it was virtually unthinkable. Terrorists hijacked and intentionally crashed 4 commercial airplanes on American soil, one into each of the Twin Towers in New York City, one into the Pentagon, and one into a Pennsylvania field as passengers fought to take back control of that aircraft. Both of the Twin Towers collapsed. It was and remains the single deadliest terrorist attack in human history. 2,977 people were killed in less than 2 hours, and countless lives were changed forever. The images of that day, the 2 burning towers set against the stark backdrop of a clear September sky, the buildings falling as the world watched, the Pentagon in flames, and the crater in a field in Pennsylvania, are seared into the collective memory of this nation. This week, In Focus is reflecting on the September 11th attacks 20 years later. While the attacks all happened hundreds of miles away from North Carolina, no part of this country was untouched by the tragedy. Many people in our state have direct ties to what happened that day, including a Triangle native who was just about as close as possible to the attacks in New York. I recently sat down with this man who worked in the World Trade Center the day it was hit to discuss his harrowing tale of survival and heroism.
I remember being consistently shocked at how bizarre this all was, how much of a departure this was from what everyone thought life was like.
That building looks like it took a major hit.
It did. It's a plane.
The images of the iconic World Trade Center towers after 2 hijacked planes slammed into them is imprinted on the minds of many Americans.
It was a feeling of impact, but almost as if our building was moving and then hit a brick wall.
For John Sikira, those memories are very different.
I was not in my office. I was in the bathroom with a few other coworkers, and we were getting ready for the day.
As he was just starting his day on the 81st floor, inside the North Tower.
When we got into the hallway was in pretty bad shape. The walls were starting to kind of collapse in. I remember seeing fire down the hallway, and we were blocked from getting back to our office. And so there were a lot of people scrambling to try to figure out what to do.
Sikira was just 22 on that fateful day, working his first job after graduating from NC State University. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into his building, just a few floors above his office.
And we're told, stay put. A plane hit the building, not to worry, and we'll get more direction. Because at that point, we didn't think it was a plane, we thought it was a plane.
It would take until a second plane hit the South Tower. 18 minutes later, that it became clear this was no accident, and he and his coworkers needed to get out.
This was intentional, not an accident, and that there wasn't a clear stopping point to this. And so that's when I think the assessment of safety went from it's safer in the building because there might be debris to we all need to move.
It's hard to imagine, but Sikira says at first the stairwell wasn't overcrowded as he quickly made his way down 16 flights to the 67th floor. It was there that he met up with his boss, Mike Benfonte. They heard screaming 1 floor above. The 2 men decided to go back up to see if they could help.
When I went back up, I knew that was not what most safety experts would recommend. Right? In fact, I kind of remember that from safety speakers in elementary school saying, if you're in a burning building, get out as quickly as you can, be safe. I knew that I was going against kind of conventional direction, but it seemed natural, and I think it was just really more it was more a slippery slope of saying, well, but there are people just right there, and I can hear them, and I can help them.
Walk, get out of the air.
Walk north, please.
But the mission would become bigger than anticipated. On the 68th floor, they found a woman, Tina, in a motorized wheelchair, and unable to evacuate on her own.
And she said, well, I'd love your help, but I'd really love for this wheelchair to move with us. And I think that was probably what was stopping them. These wheelchairs are, fairly expensive and hard to acquire. In short order, we realized that we were not going to pick up a very heavy motorized wheelchair. And she said, well, there was an emergency wheelchair that was in the office, and it had been put there after the bombing in 1993. We found that emergency wheelchair and then helped her into that.
Siqueira and Benfante would end up carrying Tina in that emergency wheelchair for 68 floors to safety. But that trek was anything but easy. The stairwell was now overcrowded, and by his best estimate, it took an hour to reach the ground, with harrowing moments during that trip.
The power went out. We were walking through kind of water around maybe calf to knee high. We realized that the path we were walking toward wasn't the path that was open anymore, and so we stopped and we turned back another way, and that way was blocked. And one firefighter said to another, what do we do now? And the superior said, I don't know. And so that was where dark, you're almost on the home stretch, and now we're faced with a scenario of no forward progress.
When Siqueira finally made it out of the building and helped load Tina into an ambulance, he found himself in the chaos of what we now know is Ground Zero. Fresh ash and debris covered the streets, remains of the South Tower, which collapsed less than a half hour earlier.
We saw faint smoke and definitely saw flames and saw debris kind of falling from up top. And so that was really the concern that, even when we were in the building, is, hey, when you get out, there might be things that are falling from pretty high up. And so we were trying to make out what was going on in the upper floors. And that's when we started seeing not just debris, but people jumping out, falling out.
Then at 10:28, Siqueira and Benfante, who you see here, began running for their lives.
I started hearing what sounded like a waterfall. That was the sound of the building crumbling, and that's when we all started running. So ran as fast as we could, and I realized that we were not going to outrun a collapsing 110-story building, and so we took cover behind some vehicles. I took cover behind a van, and Mike jumped underneath a fire truck, and the debris passed over us, and that's when it went completely dark, and gasping from running had me inhaling the debris, and so thick that it was in my throat, but also so thick that my mouth couldn't close. And at that point, felt like that was going to be the end.
But it didn't end for him, or Benfante. Tina also survived. The three would be reunited a year later at Benfante's wedding. This really changed their trajectory for you, it seems like.
It has. It's a little slower pace.
In the aftermath of this day, Siqueira wasn't ready to say goodbye to New York, but would end up leaving the Empire State permanently. Now, 20 years later, he lives in Raleigh with his wife and daughter, and says September 11th is a day that, no matter how long ago it happened, will remain with him forever.
Among the top 5 things you would spout out about New York is that everybody's busy and rude. And so this was a day where nobody was busy anymore, and everybody was on the same team, and there was this camaraderie around the city. It like grew and beyond New York and beyond the that New York metro into the whole country, into the world. That was a really magical feeling, that everybody was looking at the same thing and thinking about the same thing, and all seemed like they were on the same side.
Siqueira says he has been to the site of the attacks in New York several times to honor those who lost their lives that day. There's so many stories to share of the lives that were lost and affected that day. Coming up, I introduce you to one North Carolina family who mourns the loss of their loved one, a Navy lieutenant commander who was working in the Pentagon on September 11th, 2001. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This week on In Focus, we're reflecting on the September 11th attacks as we approach 20 years since one of the darkest days in American history. 2,977 people were killed as terrorists hijacked 4 planes and crashed them. 189 of them lost their life at the Pentagon, the headquarters for the U.S. Department of Defense. Now, 2 decades after the attack, one Navy commander who was killed on that fateful day, well, his family says they want him to be remembered for the life that he lived and not how he died.
You know, these are the memories that you forget that you had.
For Brad Cranford,
he was a Cub Scout, and then he actually was an Eagle Scout as well.
He says he'll remember his big brother Eric.
Out and about, again, traveling with friends and doing the dress up. Probably one of his first times in uniform there. So.
For being a little goofy, a hard worker, and someone he looked up to.
He was what every parent hopes their child will be. Very book smart, very book learned. Schooling, education, knowledge was always something that was just easy for him. Very intellectual. He was very athletic as well.
Today, he has to keep those memories alive through pictures.
He's there in the newspaper playing soccer.
That was big news then.
Newspaper clippings, and even a little of Eric's own words.
Imagine a cause where a nation would agree that the cause was worth risking everything. If everything underlined were to be lost, then that would be justified because failure was less acceptable than death.
Words Eric wrote in his journal on the anniversary of D-Day. Now Brad and the rest of Eric's family honor everything he risked and his death and their loss.
It humbles you to know that he's not alone, but he's part of history and represented with many others and of many different decades of service.
Navy Lieutenant Commander Eric Cranford lost his life 20 years ago, part of the 184 people who were killed at the Pentagon on 9/11. Cranford's story started in the small town of Drexel, North Carolina. His brother describes this tight-knit community as everything you could want in a place to call home.
Couple stoplights, but everybody knew everybody's business, and you liked it that way. There was no fear of hopping on your bike and being gone, and playing with all the neighbors, and just constantly having that network of community connection.
In fact, it was while growing up here that he met the love of his life and the woman who he would eventually be his wife, Emily.
They were elementary sweethearts. We still have the pictures of their Valentine dance that was their main first dating event. They stayed very close, connected through the years. Unfortunately, we're only married a little over a year, but they've been together and connected for much, much longer.
When he graduated from East Burke High School, Cranford turned down the Air Force Academy to stay a little closer to home.
Ensign Eric A. Cranford, son of Fred and Betsy Cranford,
attending North Carolina State University, where he earned a dual degree and through ROTC was commissioned to the Navy.
He flew with everyone that participated with his helicopters.
Cranford went on to train at flight school and eventually would serve 2 tours in the Persian Gulf. But then he came back home to the United States and in April of 1999 was stationed at the Pentagon, an assignment that eased Cranford's parents' concerns.
And they were so proud that he was coming stateside and going to be stationed at the Pentagon. Where else could be safer than the Pentagon?
Relief that would crumble just 2 years later, on September 11th of 2001. Brad says it would take weeks for official notification of his brother's death, but reality set in fairly quickly for him.
The news reported that the Pentagon was hit at a site that had recently been renovated. And that's when a couple things clicked, because the Naval Command Operations Center had just recently moved about 2 weeks earlier to that section that was more fortified.
It wouldn't be until over a month later that the lieutenant commander was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. Cranford is buried alongside the others who lost their lives that day at the Pentagon. A small-town North Carolina kid who loved school, his family, and the girl he met in first grade. He grew up with a mission to serve his country and died as that country came under attack. 2 decades later, his memory and his sacrifice are not forgotten.
Don't remember him for the way he died. Remember him for how he lived, because he lived a great life.
An endowed scholarship has been established at NC State University in Eric's name. It's intended for a Burke County resident who demonstrates high academic merit. Well, as the world watched in horror on 9/11, our leaders were quickly working to see how we could overcome this attack. Coming up, we talk with one member of Congress who was serving in the nation's capital on that fateful day. Stay with us. That was members of Congress on the steps of the U.S. Capitol coming together and singing God Bless America on the night of September 11th, 2001. It was a show of unity, showing strength after one of the darkest days in American history. This week, we're looking back at that day as we approach the 20 years since that attack. Thousands of lives were lost on that day as the nation watched in horror as we were attacked on our own soil. Later that evening, the show of strength and resilience by our members of Congress was aimed at showing the terrorists that they didn't win. Here in North Carolina, 2 of our current members of the congressional delegation were also serving our state on that day, including Representative David Price. Representative Price is here with us in the studio now for more. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
20 years, I mean, it's been a long time, but at the same time, it seems like it was just yesterday.
Yes, it's still a pretty fresh memory. Although I didn't have a sense at the time of the enormity of what was going on. I was in a committee meeting that morning, and around 9 o'clock, someone rushed in and said that there had been an explosion at the Pentagon. That's the first we heard. Nothing about the Twin Towers, just there had been an explosion at the Pentagon. I remember going outside the Longworth House Office building, and sure enough, there was smoke rising from the direction of the Pentagon. Went into my office and very quickly learned that we had been told to evacuate. So we went out a rear door, got instructions to leave the premises, and so I very quickly went to my apartment and waited out the day, not really knowing what was transpiring, but knowing that it was plenty serious. Of course, I learned soon enough from the media about the Twin Towers and all the 4 planes that one way or another were aimed at the heart of America.
I would think that even just hearing that there's been an explosion at the Pentagon would be scary for anybody in Washington. Yeah. I mean, the Pentagon seems like that impenetrable building.
Of course, it was very scary. I mean, we sensed that something very, very serious was afoot, but just didn't know what to make of it, and it was like everyone knew more about this than I did. While I was there in my apartment, I was hearing from outside, more than I knew from where I was. But of course, the show of unity at the end of the day was important. The coming together and acting legislatively was important. Resolving to go after those who had perpetrated this was important, and the kind of unity that we managed to muster, and already in those years the divisions were pretty deep, but we did manage to have a unified response, and the country came together. It was very, very important to show that our representative institutions were intact, and in fact we were determined to act on this.
What was it like then in Congress? The next day, the days that followed, Was it a sense of urgency, a sense of what should we be doing? What do you remember from those days that followed?
Well, I do remember a sense of urgency, of course, about the situation itself. Were there possibly other attacks in the works? Was there intelligence that would indicate that? We, of course, learned soon enough about the plane headed for the Capitol that was grounded in Pennsylvania. We did vote very soon to go after Al Qaeda and the Taliban. We had some efforts. There were some efforts early on to link this to Saddam Hussein and Iraq. I mean, there was some static, I'd say, in the information we were getting, because we suspected some people were trying to put their own spin on it or make their own use of it. But basically, my memory is of unity and resolve, and that lasted for quite a while. Not long enough, maybe, but quite a while.
Well, I think that's very true. We even heard it in the earlier stories that aired on today's show of the patriotism that you saw in this country following 9/11. It really is something that any of us who are around for it can remember that feeling.
That's right, and that was shared internationally. I do remember being struck by that every country, I think, I don't know there were any exceptions, every country expressed solidarity and sympathy and support, and that included countries like Iran, countries like, of course, Russia and China, and the sense, and then there was NATO coming together.
Right.
You know, NATO eventually was invoked on this, it was invoked because this was an attack on a member's soil, and all were obligated to defend that member, and that was us. We had never thought it would be us, but sure enough.
Congressman Price, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank you for joining our conversation as we go and focus on the big issues that are facing North Carolina. We'll see you back here next week for another edition of In Focus. Until then, have a great week.